So I've had to stop and restart due to some phone-related issues, but I'm going to try and edit these things together later on. So we were talking about Esther's illness and how it compares to James Partridge's experience of his face day and his illness, injury. So the crucial thing about Esther's illness is that we don't actually know what it is. It is generally considered to be smallpox, which was known to be like a common disfiguring illness of the Victorian times. But I've seen some kind of commentary online which suggests that it probably actually wasn't. A lot of people were vaccinated against smallpox by the time that Bleak House was set. So it doesn't make sense that it would be treated in the way that it is, where it's such where firstly, the characters get ill with it, and secondly, there's a lot of fear about contagion, which if they were vaccinated, there would be less of a fear about. And secondly, the way that Dickens describes it, he's known for quite good descriptions of illnesses. He gives almost like textbook descriptions of some of his conditions. Like a couple of years ago, I did a video about tuberculosis in Victorian novels. I didn't mention that there's a character with tuberculosis in Oliver Twist, I believe. Rose Maylie, I think it is. And he's known for like doing that really accurately. And if he was being accurate, then his description of smallpox is definitely not accurate. Things like the incubation period, things like the kinds of fevers that people got, it just doesn't seem very Dickens to have messed it up. So there is some suggestion that it could be typhus, which was a common disease of the Victorian slums at that time, which is where the disease is originally picked up. So anyway, that's a long sideline on we don't know what causes Esther to become sick, but it isn't an illness which she knows might affect people's facial appearance. And we know that because she talks about her maid Charlie getting sick, and I didn't actually mark the page. Here we go. The hope that had never been given from the first of Charlie being in outward appearance Charlie anymore soon began to be encouraged, and even that prospered. I saw her growing into her old childish likeness again. So her maid Charlie has been sick with this disease, and she catches it from Charlie, and with the knowledge that Charlie has survived any scarring, so Charlie has got through the disease without changing her outward appearance. And I think the way that they talk about Charlie's potential to change in her outward appearance, that Charlie might not be Charlie anymore, is such an important acknowledgement of how big your face is in your identity. And James Partridge talks about that, how acquiring a facial injury or a facial difference does affect how you think about your identity, and that aspect shouldn't be sort of ignored or sidelined too much. Although it doesn't change who you are, it does change sort of how you experience yourself, I suppose. Anyway, so Esther then gets sick following on from Charlie's getting sick, and Esther doesn't have the same outcome as Charlie. This is her waking up, looking around her room. She's through the worst of the illness, and she's noticed that something is missing. And yet, said I miss some familiar object. I know what it is, Charlie, it's the looking glass. Charlie got up from the table, making as if she had forgotten something, and went into the next room, and I heard her sob there. I had thought this very often. I was now certain of it. I could thank God that it was not a shock to me now. I called Charlie back, and when she came, at first pretending to smile, but as she drew nearer to me, looking grieved, I took her in my arms and said, "It matters very little, Charlie. I hope I can do without my old face very well." She then meets her guardian, and there is an interesting theme from this point on in the novel, remembering that Esther's not seen her face yet, so she's not had her face day. She knows, she's in that phase where she knows that something has happened to her face, but she doesn't know what it is. And then she sees her guardian, and he says, she says about it, "My guardian had been throughout earnest to visit me, and there was now no good reason why I shouldn't deny myself that happiness. He came one morning, and when he first came in, could only hold me in his embrace and say, 'My dear, dear girl.'" So from this point on, when Esther knows that there's something different in her face, we see characters' reactions to her being actually in a kind of a flip of that experience that we had in the earlier books, where characters were wary of the characters with facial difference. The good characters, I should say, were wary of the bad characters with facial difference. How characters react to Esther becomes a proof of their moral character. And it becomes evidence of whether they're a goodie or a baddie, I suppose, or not necessarily a baddie, but whether they can be trusted, whether they are a good, like inherently good person for her to rely on and to trust. And her guardian comes in and gives her this instant affection and sympathy. And I think that's really important, that he gives her sympathy as well, because we see a different spectrum of people meeting her. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. But first I wanted to go on to her actual face day, as James Partridge would have called it, the day when she does look in the mirror, and she makes sure that she's on her own for this stage. I let my hair down and shook it out and went up to the glass upon the dressing table. There was a little muslin curtain drawn across it. I drew it back and stood for a moment, looking through such a veil of my own hair that I could see nothing else. Then I put my hair aside and looked at the reflection in the mirror, encouraged by seeing how placidly it looked at me. I was very much changed, oh, very, very much. At first, my face was so strange to me that I think I should have put my hands before it and started back, but for the encouragement I have mentioned. Very soon it became more familiar, and then I knew the extent of the alteration in it better than I had done at first. It was not like what I had expected, but I had expected nothing definite, and I dare say anything definite would have surprised me. I had never been a beauty, and had never thought myself one, but I had been very different from this. It was all gone now. Heaven was so good to me that I could let it go, with a few not bitter tears. This is really important for Esther as a narrator, because we know, and I think there's been some discussion of that already this Victober, that she's not perhaps the most reliable narrator, and she softens things with regards to herself. She is a bit self-effacing. James Partridge is trying to be really, really honest and trying to describe the strength of his reaction. And he does that more in other aspects of that book. Esther is trying to minimise her reaction, and that is part of her demonstrating what a good character she is. Part of her moral strength is her ability to withstand this injury without being too upset by it. You can kind of see that in two ways. You know, you can see it as examples of her resilience and strength, but you can also see it as like this desire to minimize her psychological distress, and to not let that come out. So that's why I think it's really important the way that characters respond to her change when they first meet her. We've seen her guardian, Mr. Jarndyce, come in and give her a sympathy, my dear girl. We see another character also give her sympathy, and he is the only character who she sees sadness in, and his sadness in a way is the sadness that she won't let herself feel or won't let herself acknowledge. And I find that a really powerful kind of indicator. That character is Mr. Woodcourt, who she has a romantic affection for, and the fact that he is able to express not verbally, but through his facial expression and body language, express his sadness for her. That is the only way that we ever see Esther having any chance of coming to terms with or psychologically kind of processing the change that's happened to her. But it fits into that stigma, number one, you are sad and second rate. And Esther definitely has that stigma fully internalized. She thinks that she is sad and second rate. Not that she is sad, but that she is second rate. And she talks about how she had kept some flowers from Woodcourt previously when they'd met before, when she had her original looks. And she now thinks, I should burn the flowers because now that, these aren't her exact words, but now that my face has changed, he is not going to want to marry me, and I would have to release him from that engagement. I wouldn't hold him to the engagement with me when I look different. And she's completely accepted that view of herself as once you have a facial scar, your chances of marriage, they must be completely gone. So Dickens does refute that stigma, because he does give Esther a happy ending, but he allows her and other characters to also buy into it. And we get a little bit of evidence of that in another character who meets her for the first time after her injury. And this is, I think, the most negative response that she gets. And that is a character called Mr. Guppy. So Mr. Guppy has previously proposed marriage to Esther, and this is his reaction when he sees her for the first time after her illness. Miss Summerson, said Mr. Guppy, you will excuse the waywardness of a parent ever mindful of a son's happiness. My mother, though highly exasperating to the feelings, is actuated by maternal dictates. I could hardly have believed that anybody could in a moment have turned so red or changed so much as Mr. Guppy did when I now put up my veil. I ask the favour of seeing you for a few moments here, said I, in preference to calling at Mr. Keng's, because, remembering what you said on an occasion when you spoke to me in confidence, I feared I might otherwise cause you some embarrassment, Mr. Guppy. I caused him embarrassment enough as it was, I am sure. I never saw such a faltering, such confusion, such amazement and apprehension. Miss Summerson, stammered Mr. Guppy, I beg my pardon, but in our profession we find it necessary to be explicit. You have referred to an occasion, miss, when I did myself the honour of making a declaration which... Something seemed to rise in his throat that he could not possibly swallow. He put his hand there, coughed, made faces, and tried again to swallow it, coughed again, made faces again, looked all round the room, and fluttered his papers. I won't keep going because it's a scene that goes on for a while because Guppy's not the most direct character in speech. But basically he has previously proposed marriage to her and said, you know, my proposal stands. Whatever happens, I will always be ready to marry you. He sees her different face and he immediately retracts that proposal in his very convoluted manner of speech. And he says he would, you know, he's like, circumstances have arisen and he expects her to be understanding of that, and she is understanding of that, and she does accept that. She does accept that sad second-rate life chances are limited by her facial appearance, stigma that is present to this day, I suppose, but we're supposed to see that as evidence of Guppy's moral weakness. So the moral deficiency in the earlier books is all about being represented on the face, and now it's the moral strength or weakness is demonstrated by how they react to a face that is different. There is a kind of a middle ground between that negative reaction and the sympathy, I suppose, and that is the pretend nothing's happened reaction. And this is what she gets from most of the other characters in the book, who are good guys. And this is Richard, her brother, and he says, always the same dear girl. I put my veil up, but not quite. Always the same dear girl, said Richard, just as heartily as before. And it's a bit like what James Partridge was saying about needing to manage the reactions of other people. And I think Esther is grateful for this reaction, and she appreciates this reaction. But what this reaction does is it restricts her ability to respond emotionally to the situation. She has to present herself as being always the same dear girl, in order to deal with Richard's discomfort in the situation. He is trying his best to put her at ease, and he's trying his best to be comfortable with it, but he's not quite at a point where he can openly discuss it, I suppose. He has to ignore it, and it has to become sort of an elephant in the room type situation. It then wanted to flip through to the end of the book, and we see the same thing that happened in Our Mutual Friend. So the you should fix it idea, where fixing it in Dickens comes from God. Or from the passage of time and from people, you know, being and staying morally right. We see Esther sort of thinking about her appearance, and this is crucial because this is the first time she admits to it in the whole book. Like she kind of pretends that it doesn't affect her. She's not very open about her internal emotional world, even though we as a reader can tell that she goes through various things emotionally over the course of the book. So this is with her husband. What have you been thinking about, my dear? Said Alan then. How curious you are, said I. I am almost ashamed to tell you, but I will. I've been thinking about my old looks, such as they were. And what have you been thinking about them, my busy bee? Said Alan. I have been thinking that I thought it was impossible that you could have loved me any better, even if I had retained them. So this is her adjusting that sad and second-rate stigma, I suppose, to what she has actually experienced. Such as they were, said Alan, laughing. Such as they were, of course. My dear Dame Durden, said Alan, drawing my arm through his. Do you ever look in the glass? You know I do. You see me do it. And don't you know that you are prettier than you ever were? I did not know that, and I am not certain that I know it now. This is like the very end of the book. And I guess you could interpret it in two ways. You could interpret it that Alan sees her as pretty because he loves her. And that was kind of my initial interpretation. But he's very, very clear in his direction, you know, look at yourself in the mirror, you are pretty. I think what he's actually saying is that her scars are improving and her face is getting more attractive again and more back to normal, that her scars have faded. And just as a side note, scars typically, they take a couple of years to mature, and you might see that a scar does sort of fade after a couple of years, or look different, or less visible, or differently visible. To me, in terms of like the handling of facial stigma in this, it's a disappointment, because it's that kind of, oh, you know, she's been through all of this challenge and difficulty, and now, you know, her face has healed, and it has been fixed, magically fixed, because she is a morally good character, and Dickens wanted to give her a happy ending, and the way that you give a good character a happy ending is you take away all of the signs and the struggles that they've been through. So that's a disappointment. There is just there's two more things that I wanted to say. One of those is talking about the face day thing. And James Partridge and Esther Summonson, they both have the experience that people take mirrors away and withhold mirrors from them. And they go through these weeks where they don't know what to expect, where they're imagining what their face might look like. That is, to me, as a healthcare professional, don't know what other organisations do, that is not how we handle, I suppose, these situations today. And I think that kind of fits with modern sensibilities, and the way that has changed in terms of how we think about these things is demonstrated by Bleak House, the TV adaptation, because in this, Esther wakes up, you know, not the most medically accurate, but just wakes up all of a sudden and is completely back to herself, and then feels her face and feels that she's got something on her face, and immediately asks for a mirror, and is immediately, with some degree of protest, but is immediately allowed to see her face. And that is more in keeping with what I would do if somebody says to me, I want to see what my injury looks like. I'm not going to say to them, no, you can't have a mirror until you're better, because it doesn't help. I genuinely don't believe that helps people's psychological recovery and psychologically coming to terms with facial injury, is to say you can't see it, because people can imagine things that are a lot worse than what is actually true. So I was interested to see how the adaptation actually reflects the more modern sensibilities on the way that would be done, but it doesn't have that moment of strength where Esther is like on her own and confronting her own face in the mirror, so it kind of it adjusts the way that she handles that situation. The other thing that I just wanted to mention, and I apologise, I know this is a really long video, is there is one other character who has got facial difference in Bleak House, and that is a character called Phil. So Phil is a lower class character. Phil is somebody who has been down on his luck, like Esther. He doesn't really know who his parents are, and he's kind of been passed from one guardian to another over the course of his life, which is very much a reflection of Esther's own experience. Phil's experience of facial stigma is different from Esther's, and his experience of his face healing is different. But I liked how a couple of references to Phil's appearance show Dickens's more positive approach to facial stigma, I suppose. He's a character that you could very easily make out to be a bad guy, but instead we see him interacting with characters, having positive chats where he's shown as being quite sociable, and in a way, because Esther meets him before she has her facial injury, he's unwittingly a kind of almost a role model for her. Not that she ever references to that fact, but he is somebody that she knows that is living with facial scarring and living a kind of a fulfilled and happy life, but that has not been the case throughout all of his stories. So I will tell you a bit of a description of how he looks, and then I will tell you how he describes how he looks. As Phil moves about to execute this order, it appears that he is lame, though able to move very quickly. On the speckled side of his face he has no eyebrow, and on the other side he has a bushy black one, which want of uniformity gives him a very singular and rather sinister appearance. So this is Dickens acknowledging the tropes that he's used in his previous books, where facial scarring is necessarily tied to being sinister or being morally deficient. And I don't know whether to try and do Phil's accent at all, but it's quite entertaining, the way that Dickens kind of describes it. So he talks about having a job, but being kind of pushed out of that job. Besides, I was too ill looking, and their wives complained of me. So that is his reference to facial stigma affecting his sort of economic opportunities and his social opportunities. They were mighty particular. You had passed muster in a crowd, Phil, says the trooper with a pleasant smile. No, governor, returns Phil, shaking his head. No, I shouldn't. I was passable enough when I went with that tinker, though nothing to boast of then, but what with blowing the fire with my mouth when I was young, and spiling my complexion, and singeing my hair off, and swallowing the smoke, and what with being naturally unfortunate in the way of running against hot metal and marking myself by such means, and what with having turn-ups with the tinker as I got older almost whenever he was too far gone in drink, which was always, my beauty was queer, very queer, even at that time. As to since, what with a dozen years in a dark forge, where the men was given to larking, and what with being scorched in an accident at a gasworks, and what with being blowed out of the window, case filing at the firework business, I am ugly enough to make a show on. Resigning himself to which condition with a perfectly satisfied manner, Phil begs the favour of another cup of coffee. While drinking it, he says, "It was after the case filing blow up, when I first see you, Commander, you remember?" "I remember, Phil. You were walking along in the sun. Crawling, governor, again a wall." "True, Phil, shouldering your way on." "In a nightcap," exclaims Phil, excited. "In a nightcap." "And hobbling with a couple of sticks," cries Phil, still more excited. "With a couple of sticks. When you stops, you knows," cries Phil, putting down his cup and saucer, and hastily removing his plate from his knee, "and says to me, 'What, comrade? You have been in the wars?'" "I didn't say much to you, Commander, then, for I was took by surprise that a person so strong and healthy and bold as you was should stop to speak to such a limping bag of bones as I was. But you says to me, says you, delivering it out of your chest as hearty as possible, so that it was like a glass of something hot, 'What accident have you met with? You've been badly hurt. What's amiss, old boy? Cheer up and tell us about it.' Cheer up? I was cheered already. I says as much to you. You says more to me. I says more to you. You says more to me. And here I am, Commander. Here I am, Commander." Who has started from his, says Price Phil, who has started from his chair and unaccountably began to sidle away. "If a mark's wanted, or if it will improve the business, let the customers take aim at me. They can't spoil my beauty. I'm all right. Come on, if they want a man to box at, let 'em box at me. Let 'em knock me well about the head. I don't mind. If they want a lightweight to be throwed for practice, Cornwall, Devonshire or Lancashire, let 'em throw me. They won't hurt me. I've been throwed all sorts of styles all my life." With this unexpected speech, energetically delivered and accompanied by action illustrative of the various exercises referred to, Phil's squad shoulders his way around three sides of the gallery and abruptly tacking off at his commander makes a butt at him with his head, intended to express devotion to his service. I really liked this when I read it straight away, and straight away I was thinking about Face It and James Partridge, and the strategies that he talks about in the more kind of self-helpy portion of the book, where he talks about helping people to come to terms with their injuries and helping people to learn how to manage social situations where the other person in the social situation might be also scared and also unsure how to handle meeting a person with facial difference for the first time. Phil's kind of confidence, we can see that it's been born out of strife, that he's gone through a lot to get to it. And at the point when he met General George, that's the other character in this scene, he didn't have that confidence and he didn't have that happy approach to dealing with his face that he expresses at the end of his speech. At the end of his speech, he's very much talking about how he owns this injury, he accepts it, and he sees it as like an important part of him and something that gives him a kind of like a strength and a resilience, like, you know, people can do what they want because I'm strong enough to take it. Obviously that's got its own kind of story to it and side to it, but we see him as somebody who at the point when he's met by General George is very emotionally down, and that's not fully expressed, but we get this from the fact that he's so surprised that General George addresses him in a friendly manner. And it really demonstrates how one act of friendliness and one act of kindness from General George can be enough to shift Phil's journey from experiencing facial stigma, from experiencing economic and social unfortunateness, to having somebody taking him for, you know, being open about that facial injury and taking him in and taking him, you know, as a friend and as an equal. It enables him to sort of progress past it and get to a happier phase of his life. So I thought that was a bit of a positive, note to end on, in terms of how Dickens handled that character. And And yeah, and we see other characters kind of be wary of Phil and think that he might be about to shoot them or something, but we know that he's got this like friendly, happy relationship with George, that kind of sees him through. So we get that experience of facial stigma, but we also get the experience of what you might call post-traumatic growth, where he's been through, because of it, you know, it's something that in Dickensian world and also in the modern world, injury and ill health is tied to the circumstances in which he grew up. He grew up in a disadvantaged situation, and that is why he has worked in all of these dangerous professions and acquired various different injuries throughout his life and his career. And that becomes a self-perpetuating cycle, but then we get this kind of post-traumatic growth after that, where he becomes like fulfilled and happy and able to accept his life and move on, and mirrors what we see for Esther, that she also has this kind of growth past her illness. Anyway, so I apologise, that was a very long video, but you'll have seen how long it was when you started out, and I'm sure you're only here if you found it at least remotely interesting. Thank you very much for watching. Please put your thoughts below about fascism in Victorian literature. I know there are so many other examples, Jekyll and Hyde, some of the characters in Sherlock Holmes. I really loved seeing how this very modern non-fiction really clearly portrayed some of these things in the Victorian fiction. So feel free to put your connections that you've made in the comments, and we can talk about them. If there's other Dickens novels that could have been featured that I didn't know about because I've not read them, please do tell me. And yeah, enjoy the very limited rest of your Victober. I'm reading The Warden, which also has a character with a burned face in it, who's one of the cottagers, the sort of pensioners in the Warden's hospital. So found that quite interesting as well. I've yet to see whether that turns out to be whether fascism appears in The Warden, but I will be looking out for it, I can assure you. Thank you very much for watching, and take care.